Hey everyone, welcome back to PDA UK. Today I am talking to the marvelous Cathy Wassell, who has written a book on nurturing and preparing preteens and teens who are newly diagnosed on the autism spectrum. As I say, welcome back to PDA UK. Before I go on, can you go hit like, hit subscribe, ring the bell? You'll always know when I've got new content coming up. You'll also be helping me hit that 10,000 subscriber mark, which will be a huge thing for me and just means that these videos get out to the people who really need them. So as I say, we are interviewing today the fantastic Cathy Wassell. Cathy, how are you today?
I am fine, thank you.
As I said before, Cathy has written a book on nurturing and preparing your teens and preteen kids for basically who are newly diagnosed for life and for how to support them better. Cathy, can you give us a bit of an outline about the book?
Yeah, sure. So this is the book cover. It's the book that I wish that I had had to read when my 13-year-old was diagnosed. It's going to be more for people who have teens and preteens and only finding out that they're autistic in those moments rather than children who are diagnosed quite young. It's basically for parents, like a handbook for parents to be able to make the world a more comfortable place for your autistic young person. That's basically the premise of it.
And that's fantastic. And it's one of the things that I mean we talk about a lot on this channel is the fact that life shouldn't be about trying to make your autistic young person fit into a world that is, very neurotypically focused. It's about supporting them where they're at, and that's really the focus that you've got in this book. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. Very much difference, not deficit. So I run Autistic Girls Network charity, and we completely reject the idea of deficit and the kind of pathologizing of autism. And this book is definitely about making life more comfortable for your autistic young person and helping you to be able to make everyone else around them understand what they need and
Which is so
understand that
key.
the way that they perceive the world is perfectly valid.
Absolutely right. We talk about it a lot. The whole idea that basically autism is essentially just a different perspective in the world. It's just the
Yeah.
way the brain works differently. I've likened it to guitars in the past. You can play the same thing on an acoustic, the same thing on an electric, and they're going to sound very different and have a very different interpretation. The same notes have been played on this primarily the same instrument, but just the difference in the way it's processed by the individual instrument is going to make a big difference to how it comes out at the other side. And I think it's such an important thing. And you mentioned there, obviously, you're the CEO of the Autistic Girls Network. Can you tell us a bit about that? What do they do, and what do you got?
Yeah, so it's actually nearly our 5th birthday. So we're 5 on when are we 5? The 17th of
Fantastic.
December. Although we weren't originally called Autistic Girls Network, it was originally called FIGS, which stands for Fighting Inequality for Girls on the Spectrum.
Yeah.
So it was founded by a lady called Mandy who had autistic children, but boys and girls. And with her girls, it was very, very much more difficult to get them diagnosed and get them recognised as autistic,
Well,
which
this is
is
a
a
big
common
thing.
theme.
It's a very common thing. I mean, it took us 8 years to get my daughter diagnosed. That was from, the first presentation of trying to go through get on the pathway and get diagnosis. There is a real whole, we talked in a recent episode about the fact there's still a myth out there that girls can't have autism. And I say can't have autism because that's the way it's professionally phrased. But yeah, essentially girls can't be autistic. It's obviously not true. And
No,
the
of course
majority
not.
of people don't follow that, but it's still something that crops up. I talk to parents who've spoken to a teacher or to a headmaster or, somebody who's in authority or, even professionals in the system will say, well, this girl can't be autistic. So, and they just
Yeah,
dismiss
we
it like that.
created a graphic a while ago, might have been last year, with all the reasons we'd been told in the group, because we have a Facebook group of about 12,000, all the reasons that we'd been told that you couldn't be referred, or your daughter couldn't be referred, or couldn't be diagnosed. And it was things like too clever, has friends, makes eye contact, just absolute rubbish, all of them,
All
not
the
part of the
classic signs of
diagnostic criteria.
masking, I believe.
Yes, indeed. Indeed. But sadly, even today, those things do still happen, sadly.
it still prevails as this mythology, and it just
Yeah.
it makes such a difference. And as you say, that I mean, we talked about it. The whole point is that the diagnostic process for autism is so male focused on traditional male autism, and it creates such a barrier for girls who are needing
Yeah, and
diagnosis.
I mean, and not only just girls. We should say that. So we wrote a white paper this year that we published on International Women's Day called Autism Girls and Keeping It All Inside.
Mm,
But it wasn't only about girls. It was about an internal presentation of autism, which can be the case not only for girls but for boys and non-binary young people too.
absolutely.
Certainly, my nephew presents in an internal way,
Yeah.
and yeah, that it's more common in girls, and girls who don't present in that internal way are probably have got diagnosed younger. But yeah, it's the internal presentation that's the issue here.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, the diagnostic criteria for autism, or rather, autism is diagnosed on the basis of observable behaviours. And
Yes.
if those behaviours aren't observed, they won't get referred. And this is what's happening. There's research in Wales that's showed that girls get diagnosed up to 6 years later than boys. Even though
Yeah.
we couldn't put that in our white paper because I didn't have that research then. So in
But
our white paper, it says 2 to 3 years later, which was the previous research. But we knew that wasn't true. You
yeah.
know, anecdotally, from what we see in the group, we knew that wasn't true.
Yeah.
We did a survey a couple of years ago, and at that time, there was a person in the group who had waited 20 years between referral and actually getting a diagnosis. And in between those years, she had been misdiagnosed as BPD, etc., etc. We've also had an 83-year-old join the group who had just got
Wow.
her diagnosis.
Well, and this is becoming more. This is something I'm seeing more and more as well, and I think it's because there's this element there that a lot of adults are now being diagnosed on the basis that it was unrecognized in their childhood, but they see their kids and they go, I behaved, I was very similar to that, and I did these things, and I had, and they're realizing they themselves are neurodivergent. And I mean, you're neurodivergent yourself, I believe.
Yeah, and my husband is always autistic also, and dyspraxic, and probably other things. Who knows?
All the other icks that go
Yeah,
with, yeah.
yeah. We're all multiply neurodivergent in our family.
What are your particular diagnoses or your presentations?
I would say my brain is mostly ADHD. So I would say or DHD. But I think my brain has more of a dollop of ADHD than than anything else. I don't think I'm dyspraxic. We definitely have dyspraxia in our family. I don't think I'm dyspraxic. But who knows? I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of these things kind of end up in the same bucket, if you like, at some point. But the whole thing is very controversial, isn't it? We
But
we
it
don't
shouldn't
help
be.
ourselves, I don't think, in the neurodivergent community by arguing against each other. I think that we need to all stick together and kind of just build an awareness of neurodivergence generally. I think that's what's going to help.
I think that's so bang on. And I mean, obviously I'm speaking as a neurotypical myself. My association with neurodivergence is adjacent, if you like. So family members, my daughter, my wife, and probably other people. I know of other people in my family who have different elements of neurodivergence depending on who they are and where they're at. But I think there's this thing of working together. And I think it comes across this neuro divide that we talk about as well. There's this sense that, and it's a justified thing, but there's this sense of us and them. And I come across it every now and again where somebody's like, well, you're not neurodivergent. Why are you talking about this stuff? And I understand it. I genuinely do. I understand where that comes from, because it's very hard not to be combative when you're constantly met with roadblocks. But I think there's such an important thing to standing together. I talk about the bridge, and you can build a bridge between two communities, but it takes somebody to get across it, or two people to hopefully meet in the middle. And something I've learned is that, so I talk with Tika Pritchard a lot. We do the Across the Neurodivide podcast on this channel. And we talk about it in that sense that what I had to do was learn that, yeah, we meet in the middle, but at some point I had to turn and face the same direction as him, because I needed to sort of start making the same points across to those who are listening, that this stuff's important. We need to be moving past simply autism acceptance, which is the sort of
we need understanding.
It was what there was the understanding, then it changed to autism acceptance, which I think is great. But I think there needs to be a celebratory element to it as well. We need to, and this was something that I liked about doing a bit of research on your book, is that you want to support newly diagnosed young people who are late diagnosed, obviously, is where the focus is, but you want to support them in the beauty and the awesomeness that comes with being neurodivergent as well.
Yeah, I want to build a positive autistic identity or neurodivergent identity.
Yeah.
I think that's really, really important.
It really is. And I think it's something that it matters. And the more we can get that message out there, I hope that more people who are on the other side, the neurotypical community that don't understand because they've never had to, will take the time to start looking at this and seeing they're just other people. And
I mean, the thing is, it's really important to get parents on board. I mean, for a start, it's very likely that if you have an autistic child, one of you will be autistic too. I mean, that's just biology. You may not know, and that is kind of tackled in the book, that it is something that you might discover about yourself. But you have to have parents on board. How are we going to build self-confidence? How are we going to build a positive identity about your tween or teen if the parents aren't on board and aren't nurturing them? It's not going to happen. And that's why I'm trying to help people to get everyone around them on board as well. That's not always going to be possible, and there will be times when I think you need to kind of remove yourself and your family, for your own benefit and your own wellness.
Divide, isn't there? There's a generational divide that occurs with this, because I was having a very interesting conversation with a lady who's got she's got a number of neurodivergent kids. One of her kids has Down syndrome, and we were talking, and her mum was there. We just met in the cafe. We just bumped into them, and my wife and I were having a coffee, and the mother was clearly struggling with some of she wanted to use the word normal, and she was sort of catching herself in it, but then she was getting cross at herself, but also cross at everybody else, because that's what's a phrase she'd always used. And I was trying to very gently say, no, I actually understand. It's, and trying to bring it around. So, but this is, can you see why somebody might find it offensive if they are neurodivergent and you're using the term normal, that it makes them feel abnormal? And she was, I don't mean it that way though. And it's such a difficult thing, because that generational divide is there. I experienced it recently we were talking about Eddie Izzard on the Grumpy Gits. And Eddie started using the pronoun she, her. And I've always referred to Eddie Izzard as he, him, as we all had, because that's how she'd always presented herself, but now has changed for good reason and absolutely the right thing to do for her. But it was difficult trying to, just as you're talking, not to slip up and say he or him. It's because you kind of got this mindset, but like your brain is trained to be a certain way.
And
then
that's
you're having to shift it.
Perfectly understandable.
Yeah, it's a really hard thing when you hit that generational divide, and you get that even further, I think, with neurodivergence, because people see, it didn't used to be like this. It's like, well, it did. It's just, it wasn't, people weren't aware of it, and people were undiagnosed, which is why there's this big swell of, late diagnosis in adult years. When were you diagnosed? When did you get your diagnosis?
Yeah, pretty recently. Yeah. Recently.
So you experienced the same thing.
I should say self-diagnosis is valid. We very much believe self-diagnosis is valid.
Yeah.
Diagnosis is not always possible, especially for adults. And globally around the world, diagnosis by a clinician is not always possible. And to be honest, not all clinicians diagnose in a way that should happen, quite frankly. You
get certain profiles as well within the spectrum, things like PDA. Only 30% of the UK recognise PDA and would diagnose it anyway. That doesn't mean someone isn't living with a PDA profile. It just means that they can't get that diagnosed in their area. It shifts onto an interesting topic, which I think is the need for diagnosis. And I've seen this cropping up a lot in discussions on my group on Facebook and other groups on Facebook at the moment, where people sort of, there's this almost conflict coming between, do we, is diagnosis important? Is it not important? My personal thoughts are, it doesn't matter which way you go. It's down to the individual. For you, was diagnosis important?
Not a clinical diagnosis,
No.
no. I think it's important in terms of you need to know what your identity is. You
Yeah.
need to be comfortable with what your identity is. You need to accept whatever's going on in your neurology. And it also is important, unfortunately, in terms of getting support,
Yeah.
claiming benefits, etc., etc. Things like EHCPs, educational health and care plans, are not meant to be diagnosis led, meant to be needs led, and you shouldn't need a diagnosis for an EHCP or for disability living allowance. You shouldn't need a diagnosis. However, I don't think many people would argue that it's definitely easier. It's an easier road
Yeah.
with a piece of paper, unfortunately. I would love for it to be the case where it doesn't matter. So nobody has to prove anything and everyone, nobody has to pay to go privately and all of those things. I would love that to happen. But unfortunately, at the moment, that is not where we are. Maybe we will be in 20 years' time. Maybe we will be, and that's great. And
As we
I
currently
can't see it
stand.
happening.
But
Unfortunately, the way that our education system is set up is quite combative, and you kind of have to prove need.
Yeah.
And a diagnosis is proving need. Sometimes even a private diagnosis isn't accepted as proving need. So it is difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, if you are looking at private diagnosis, I strongly suggest you research it first to make sure that your channel that you're going down for private diagnosis will be recognised by the NHS, because if it's not, then it's almost not worth the paper it's written on, which is tragic and wrong, but it's the way it is at the moment. So I'm guessing all these sort of things culminated, and the result is that you've written this book. What was your inspiration for doing this?
I can't go into my personal story too much, and I don't go into it in the book either, because it's about my daughter and it's not my story to tell.
Yeah.
It's hers. And maybe at some point in the future, she might want to tell it. At the moment, she doesn't. What I can say is that we had a very tough time. We had lots of involvement with CAMS. We had lots of involvement with social care, flex learning, with intensive support team, etc., etc. You name it, we had involvement with it. And it became obvious just how difficult it was to get support when you don't follow that path of an early diagnosis when a child is young. Not that I'm saying that the support that you get and the path that you follow when your child is diagnosed young is brilliant and perfect. I'm not saying that, of course, we know that that's not the case. But unfortunately, when you are diagnosed in secondary school, for example, or later, there is very little support that's put in place. There's no automatic path that you follow if you have an EHCP, and if you are under CAMS at a high tier, which would be 3 or 4, then you hopefully would get some support put in place. Although even that, unfortunately, is not. You can't take that for granted either.
No.
It's just not the same as when you were diagnosed young. And so we have an awful lot of people who are in crisis because that's the only way that they've been recognised as autistic. Because again, we're back to those observable behaviours. And for a lot of young people that are diagnosed in their teens, for example, the only reason that they've been recognised as autistic is because they can't mask anymore, and you can then observe those behaviours, unfortunately. So what we need to get to is, and what we campaign for in Autistic Girls Network, is a position where we are recognising those who present internally and those who mask, and we're recognising them at a younger age. We want to be in a position where they are all diagnosed in primary school, or before, of course, so that they're not going through that transition to secondary school without a diagnosis. Once they have transitioned to secondary school without recognition of their neurotype, without any support, because nobody realised, I don't want to say it's too late. Of course, it's not too late, but in a sense, the damage has been done. Probably mental health damage has been done, and it's hard to get back from that. And we did a survey, well, it must have been before the pandemic now, so we should probably do another one, really. But we found when in this survey, we found that the point the average point where it all went pear-shaped, and that either severe mental health crisis or school emotionally based school avoidance, or whatever it might be, the point where that happened tended to be the February half term of year 7. So they've gone through the transition to secondary, they've made it to Christmas, they've come back, they've realised it's not getting any better. In fact, it might be getting worse. And that's when it's all gone pear-shaped. This is a huge wake-up call, surely. If we have children that are so traumatised through one term of school, secondary school, something's wrong, isn't it?
It really is. And we know through research, and I mean, we talked about it on this channel before, through polyvagal theory and stuff like that, that the trauma enhances a lot of the challenging traits that autistic people will experience themselves. So it enhances anxiety, which, the world knows anxiety is not a good thing. It's something that is damaging and causes issues down the track, which means that you do face things like PTSD. It often develops into other, conditions and disorders, things like bipolar disorder. So my wife was undiagnosed. She's diagnosed as bipolar now. We know that it's because neurodivergence is in the female side of her bloodline, and it's obviously my daughter's the same. It's one of those things that if we don't deal with the trauma as early as possible so that we can support our kids so that they don't experience that level of trauma, then it's going to lead to other issues further on in life that are going to be considerably more challenging and difficult to overcome and have real life impact.
Yeah, and the statistics for autistic people particularly are dreadful. The statistics on employment, the statistics on mental health, the statistics even on life expectancy are dreadful. Yeah. But those statistics are not true statistics because there are so many unrecognised autistic adults who aren't part of those statistics, who have got married, who have got a job, who may have needed support, yes, and they may have develop strategies of their own and perhaps even unhealthy coping mechanisms such as alcohol, etc. I'm not saying that they've had a perfect life, but they are not in those statistics. And unfortunately, that means that we have, I don't know, I think it's like a vicious circle. It's undoubtedly these things are happening because we are growing up in a neurotypical world that's really not made for us. But we also have this kind of narrative that this is what happens when you're autistic. You're anxious, you develop mental health problems, you might die early. I'm sorry to be so blunt there. But it doesn't have to be like that.
This is it.
It doesn't have to be like that. It is not inevitable.
It's imposed, not inevitable. I think,
So if we can change the environment, if we can educate everybody, and I mean everybody, I'm fed up with these interventions that only are carried out, awful word, isn't it? Awful phrase, rather, on autistic young people or neurodivergent young people. If we have whole school education on neurodiversity and difference, not deficit, for a start, it will change those awful statistics on bullying. Unfortunately, it's just a fact that neurodivergent children are bullied much, much more in school than their neurotypical peers.
Exactly.
We start changing. If we start tackling the stigma about being autistic or being neurodivergent, then we start changing things. We start changing people's attitudes. We start changing outcomes. And it's not going to happen overnight. But if we don't even start it, then it's never going to happen at all.
No, that's bang on. And it is that. I mean, we the grumpy gets, myself and Chris particularly, because we're both parents of neurodivergent kids. Chris is recently diagnosed ADHD himself. It starts with education, and it is that thing of the earlier that we can get in and we can start teaching, I think, young kids about the fact that we are in a diverse world, diverse racially, diverse in sexuality, diverse in gender, diverse in so many ways, but diverse in neurotype. Because we're in a world that's like that, you start to accept it. A lot of these things sort of are driven in from early ages, I think. And if we can overcome that in early age.
Yeah. And there was a lovely tweet, actually, I think it was last week. It was from a teacher who had read with his class, had read one of Elle McNichol's books. I think it was Kind of Spark, but I'm not sure. And the kids had absolutely loved it. This was a primary age class. The kids had really loved it. It had developed all these great discussions about difference, about neurodiversity. They wanted to learn more. That's what we need.
Yeah.
That is how to teach about neurodiversity and acceptance of difference. And of course, we can't do that without autistic authors or neurodivergent authors writing about neurodivergent characters. And luckily, that's happening, loads and loads more.
It's happening more and more, isn't it? I've noticed this trend as well. What I'm really pleased with is things like CBeebies and CBBC. You've got things like Newsround. Martin Dugan obviously is on Newsround, who is a wheelchair user. He's an amazing guy. His story's fantastic. This is coming out more and more, and I'm seeing more and more books. Dan White is a friend who's just written a whole series of books, children's books on disability and difference and so forth. This stuff is coming out more and more. I feel like we're on the brink of something big with it. It's like it feels like when we've made these massive leaps forward in other ways, when it came down to sexuality, when it came down to racial difference and all that kind of stuff, that we're all still one human race.
But also none of those happened overnight.
Exactly.
That kind of movement, that didn't just like, oh, we've turned into 2020 now. Suddenly we're all, we all know everything about Black Lives Matter, etc., etc.
Yeah.
It took time, and although
if you think about it, that started with Rosa Parks in a sense.
Yeah. Although if we talk about Black Lives Matter, it feels like that did have a bit of a jump.
You did. There was a moment.
It was based on work that had been going on for years and years. Absolutely. And so, I'm not saying that we're going to be able to change everything overnight. I know that that's not going to happen. But also, if we look back 10 years ago, things have changed massively. There has been change, undoubtedly. And we might not have noticed it at the time because it's just little increments every month. We're just changing little bits at a time. But there has been a massive difference since 10 years ago. So, of course, we want it to change quicker, but it is changing. I think we need to acknowledge that.
I want to draw this back to the book and yourself. So the book is sort of how to's the wrong phrase, but it's giving advice on how you can best support your neurodivergent.
Yeah, so it's got lots and lots. I mean, it's got a lot in it. It's 80,000 words, so there's a lot in it. It's divided into, I think, three different parts. So there's part one is what is autism, and so it's looking about sensory stuff. It's looking at all the different possible co-occurring conditions, so that you can kind of think, you can kind of start to make connections. It's talking about, autism presentation in different groups. So, there'll be stuff in there about gender, stuff in there about all kind of different things. Autism myths, which is probably was a good chapter for me to write. And also useful stuff to know about how to create a happy autistic life.
Absolutely.
So that's there.
I love that. Can I say, I love that phrase, a happy autistic life. That should be the thing. It's like creating a happy autistic life. I think that's bang on.
I think that's the most important thing of all, isn't it?
It is.
With everything. And then part two is living a happy autistic life. So then we've got some strategies to help support your autistic young person. Autism at home, autism in school, which is quite a big chapter. Autism in society and the future. And then in part three, it's talking about diagnosis, post-diagnosis, and then support available. It's kind of like a little pocket book that you could dip into. You wouldn't necessarily read it all at once.
Yeah.
But it's kind of will teach you most of the things that you need to know, most of the things that I wanted to know and that took me ages to find out.
So it's like a reference book almost. It's not.
Yeah.
It's a novel.
It's written in an easy, fun manner.
Yeah.
Not fun. Fun's not the right word. But no, it has got fun.
I think that's often a good thing. And I think, again, it's why we do the Grumpy Gits, because disability in general is just so heavy and laden. I think the best, forms of awareness and promotion and acceptance and, celebration is when it's made fun, when you have something that's lighter and delves into the heavy stuff, but does it in a way that shows that, we're funny people too. We're humorous. We're lighthearted. We're all those things.
Yeah. Well, I was talking to a lady the other day who has two autistic young people. They're adults now, but they were diagnosed 20 years, or her daughter was diagnosed 20 years ago. And she said at the time there was just nothing. There was nothing at all available. Not any support, but not even any information. And so for her, when she was given that diagnosis, and her daughter was diagnosed quite young,
Yeah.
when she was told that diagnosis, it was awful for her. It was a thing that to grieve about.
Yeah.
It was a thing that she didn't understand, and she had no hope of being able to understand because there was nobody to help her.
Yeah.
Now, I very much hope that nobody is in that position today. Nobody needs to be in that
Nobody
position.
needs to be, but I constantly come across people who are,
Yes,
sadly.
I know. Yeah. The problem is that the less involved you are in groups like ours, the less you find out about it, the more entrenched you are in your own beliefs, the more difficult it is going to be.
Absolutely.
But it doesn't need to be that way. When we find out about people's diagnoses, we celebrate. And I sent somebody a cake the other day.
That's awesome.
Congratulations on the autism. That was kind of a joke. The wording was
no, but that's actually how it should be. I love that.
We celebrate, because for a start, almost everybody in my group is late diagnosed, just because of the nature of it, just because it's mostly about girls.
Yeah.
Almost everyone is late diagnosed, and unfortunately that usually comes with strings. That usually comes with mental health problems. That usually comes with a significant amount of trauma that has happened. 20 years time, I would love to not be there, and I would love for none of that trauma and mental health issues to have been there, but that's where we are at the moment. Getting a diagnosis is something to celebrate now, because now you know why some things have happened.
Yeah.
Yes, it's nothing to celebrate that you are in a bad place mentally. It's nothing to celebrate that you've had no support. That's not anything to celebrate. But we can celebrate that now we know, and now that you have an identity that you can build on, and now you or your advocates, if you're not in a position yet to be able to do it yourself, can fight the world for you. Absolutely. And can help everyone else to get in the right place. It's taken some time, but I think most of our extended family are in the right place now. But close family, it was never a problem. But extended family, it has taken some more time. Absolutely. And there has been quite a lot of self-imposed isolation. But we're there now. I think we're there with understanding, maybe not full understanding, but enough. You need somebody to fight your corner for you. Absolutely. In the early days, because you're not going to be, especially if you've had mental health problems. I'm talking about the young people here. If you've had mental health problems, if you've had school trauma, which unfortunately is very likely, you're going to need somebody to fight your corner for you.
Yeah. And there's no weakness in that.
No, of course not.
I think that's where it gets perceived as because I'm not doing this all alone, I'm suddenly I'm weak. I think there's courage and strength in being able to go, you know what, I need some support here. I need somebody by my side. And I think that's where it's at. It's about having someone by your side, not somebody who
by your side, but also helping you to arm yourself and to be able eventually to be able to advocate for yourself, because that's what we're aiming for. I don't think there's ever any shame in having your parents stick up for you and having your parents support you. I mean, God, my parents support me, and I'm 53.
I think it's like learning an instrument. And this is the thing, is that you don't. My son wants to play guitar. I'm a guitarist myself, and he wants to play guitar. And the trouble is with anything like that for him is that if he's not immediately brilliant at it, he kind of, I'm not interested in this. He's 7, so that's a natural thing. You learn in time that, when I learned guitar, I had to pick it up. I had to learn the first chord, then you learn the second chord, then you learn to combine them, and then there's a process. And you don't just pick up a guitar. Very few people can pick up a guitar and just suddenly be magic at it. We're not all Eddie Van Halens, and you have to learn, and you have to go through a process of learning it before you can step out on your own and become your own thing. It's a scaffolding, if you like. When you're putting a building up, you put the scaffolding up first. The building gets built up until it's strong enough. Then the scaffolding can come away.
And that can be hard, particularly if you're ADHD. Yeah, it can be hard to have that kind of patience. I don't have that kind of patience. I couldn't learn an instrument.
I'm going to start rounding this up, and I want to go into a few different categories. Just if you are a parent or a carer of a young person who is neurodivergent, what's the biggest piece of advice you can give to that parent or carer?
It's the piece of advice that I would give to anyone, a teacher as well, a professional as well.
Yeah.
And this is assuming that parent isn't neurodivergent themselves. Open your mind to the idea that other people experience the world in different ways, and that your child is experiencing the world in a different way to you. Because once you take that in, and once you start to think that actually the way that you experience the world is not the right way, it's only one of many right ways, it changes everything. It's almost like a cultural difference. My daughter, she went before anyone knew that she was autistic or neurodivergent of various flavors. Before anyone knew that, she was in a science lesson, and they were doing an experiment about sound, and they were meant to be creating a sound that was meant to be not heard by humans. And she who never spoke up in class, very, as we now know, very typical female autistic presentation, or I should say internal autistic presentation, she spoke up and she said, "I can hear it." And the teacher, scoffed at her and said, no, she couldn't hear it. And she, unheard of, she stood up for herself and she said, "No, I can hear it," and was adamant that she could hear it. I'm sure she wasn't, obviously I wasn't there, but I'm sure she wasn't rude, because she never would have been rude to anybody, child or adult. But she stuck up for herself and said that she could hear it. And she got a detention because that teacher could not envisage the idea that somebody could experience the world in a different way to them. And she didn't go to the detention, by the way, but she was understandably completely indignant about this, because of course, being autistic, she has a strong sense of social justice, very, very strong sense of social justice, and it wasn't fair. And of course it wasn't fair, but that is what we're dealing with. We're dealing with the idea that there is only one way to experience the world.
Yeah.
And there's not. So that is the notion that we have to kind of explode.
So to broaden that, if you're a family member from extended family, or a friend, close friend, somebody who knows families in this position, the one piece of advice you'd give to them?
I would say listen to the parents. Don't try to impose your idea of what's right and what is acceptable behaviour on them. Listen to them and offer them the support that they want, not the support that you want to give. That is the best thing that you can do. And if you can't do that, step away for a bit.
Yeah.
In a good way, not in a explosive big argument kind of way, but just keep out of it if you can't do that.
And in a way, I think also that you're not abandoning the person, because that's a big thing a lot of parents, carers, and neurodivergent people themselves experience, is this sudden feeling of isolation that's there.
Yeah.
Be there as a friend, but just don't get into this area of conversation and so forth. And
It's like, if you can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all. Is that?
Yeah, it's simple advice, isn't it? We all hear. Yeah. Finally, if you are a neurodivergent person yourself and you're new to this and you're starting to embrace this, what's the piece of advice you give there?
I would say forgive yourself for what you may have done. And this is slightly covered in the book, where we talk about eye contact. And it's very possible that in the past you will have said to your child, "Look at me when I'm talking to you."
Yeah.
Probably most of us have done that. I've done that. And of course now I feel awful that I did that. But that's the way that we were brought up. And we can't go back and change that. We don't have a time machine. So what we need to do is apologize for it, but then move on and say, look, we're going to make sure that doesn't happen anymore, and we're going to make sure that we don't let other people say that to you. So it's just kind of forgive yourself for the things that might have happened, and just kind of draw a slate under that and move on the way that you want to be moving on.
So, Cathy, thank you so much for joining us. I know I've already learned something, quite a bit from this conversation. The book is available through Amazon, through all good publishers, I believe.
Yeah,
I'll put the links in the
pre-order.
description for that. But I believe you have a copy you're going to give away as well.
Yes, I do.
So what we'll do is, if you put a comment on this, just to say, I'd like to be entered. And what we'll do is, in a week's time, we will make an announcement about who's won that and organise to get that out to you. Cathy, thank you so much for joining us and taking the time. It's been awesome.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me on
Good
here.
luck with the book as well.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us, everyone. As I say, please do go hit like, hit subscribe, ring the bell. You'll always know when new content's up. Do put a comment in there and just say you'd like to be entered in the competition. And as soon as we're a week in, we will make an announcement and get that out to whoever the lucky winner is. I will see you again on the next episode. In the meantime, please do stay safe.